Good morning, everyone. Namaskar. I'm Dr. Sudhnya N. Kulkarni, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Janki Devi Memorial College, University of Delhi. I teach in the Department of Philosophy there. And today we will come to unit which is talking about importance and challenges of ethics. And under this, we are definitely going to look at the work of Joseph Fletcher. And now, before I get down to talking about the importance of ethics and how ethics actually goes on to impact human conduct and behavior in society, the unit is also going to look at and understand some of the important challenges that have come about or arisen within ethics as a philosophical discipline. Now, some of these challenges have tried to make the subject matter of ethics itself relative. So, we are going to look into this and look at some of the challenges that have come about in the field of ethics. Now, in this unit, we attempt to look at some of the figures in the traditional Western philosophy like Joseph Fletcher and Maurice Ginsburg. Both of the figures represent the challenges that have come about in the field of ethics. The unit, apart from looking at these challenges, is also going to look at and offer an in-depth analysis of their positions. But before we get down to looking at the positions of Joseph Fletcher and Maurice Ginsburg, I'm going to try and explain what we understand by ethics. Now, what is ethics? Ethics is basically the study of human behavior. The subject, like I mentioned earlier, is a part of the discipline of philosophy and is also termed as moral philosophy. Now, why is it termed as moral philosophy or another term that is given for ethics? The reason being, we are looking at or analyzing the behavior or intrapersonal or interpersonal relationship that human beings have vis-a-vis each other. And in this, when we are looking at or analyzing human behavior, what we are actually doing is that we are trying to look at the ways in which humans interact with each other, and given that interaction has or takes place in a form or in a situation which has been designed by the humans, we try to put it within parameters of behavior that is pardonable or behavior that is acceptable. So, when you do this kind of study, that is what ethics involves. It looks at ways in which we can analyze human behavior and term it as right or wrong. Now, the reason being, man as a rational animal possesses the sense of making a distinction between right and wrong. As we possess this distinction or this capacity within us to decide between what is right and wrong, therefore we go on to classify all human behavior or our behavior vis-a-vis each other. And in today's contemporary times, we are not only looking at human behavior vis-a-vis each other, but we are also trying to understand human beings' behavior vis-a-vis other living beings and classifying that behavior as right and wrong. So, when we look at ethics, we will say that it is a study of human behavior, and it is one of the subjects that is studied in philosophy. So, if you have ethics, we have metaphysics, we have moral philosophy, another term for ethics. We have epistemology, we have philosophy of law, we have philosophy of science, we have philosophy of religion, and we have philosophy of mind, and many other subdisciplines within the parent discipline of philosophy, and ethics is one of them. Now, when we talk about this inherent rational or reasoning capacity that is there within each of us, we cannot simply rely on this inherent awareness alone while deciding on the rightness or wrongness of actions, because this inherent capacity or rationality or reasoning is for sure present in each one of us. But for sure, we cannot just depend on that to determine what actions are going to be right or wrong. So, ethics or moral philosophy looks for answers, and when ethical theories or ethical philosophy tries to do that, then we want to get down into root causes, and from those root causes we draw implications from it, and we present those implications in the form of a reasoned argument. And when we do that, that reasoned argument basically tells us about those actions that are permissible and actions which are prohibited, and they were not going to be permissible or prohibited simply because we are resorting to our inherent rationality or reasoning capacity, but rather we are going to look at the arguments which have been put forward. The study of ethics has been important, for man has made attempts to understand how to lead a good life and be happy at the same time. Now, in order to achieve this status of leading a good life and being happy, men set up certain rules of conduct. Now, these rules basically specified which forms of behavior were acceptable or not acceptable in a social group. Now, it is these rules which have been discussed, debated since the dawn of human history and are still debated today. So, when you talk about the subject matter of ethics, we are looking up or looking out for rules of conduct which specify the forms of behavior that are acceptable or not acceptable in a social group. Now, the spread of education combined with the growth of science and technology has brought into open certain issues in the discipline of ethics which seem challenging in the present context. Deeper questions regarding meaning of life, what constitutes a good life, what is the significance of the world in which we live, are all raised in the hope of being able to find some answers. So what we find now is that ethical issues which may have been relevant, say centuries back or say in the medieval period, may not be as relevant as in today's time. The reason being education, and apart from that, the growth of science and technology, it has brought into our arena certain questions and in the discipline of ethics which may not have been present at all at that point of time. And for one example I could talk about is of course cyber, so now we look at cyber security, we look at cyber crimes, we look at cyber stalking, and all of these put forth certain ethical issues which are actually talking about certain infringement of human privacy, even though it may be in virtual world, but these are issues which are concerned with ethics, and in today's discipline of ethics there surely matters or issues that are being looked into. Now, when we talk about ethics, or we have been discussing about ethics, there is one such perspective on ethics that is done as a study of human behavior, and this study looks at and also examines the very basis of the existence of objective moral principles, say put forward by Immanuel Kant, who talked about the categorical imperative. Now, situation ethics basically is a perspective which is questioning the deeper foundations of objective moral principles. Now, when we go back to Immanuel Kant, he did of course write a very important book, Groundwork of Metaphysics of Morals, and in that he talked about how we need to have principles of morality, and those principles of morality cannot be dependent on any other principle or any other rule or any other being or divinity, because if that were be the case, then that rule would not be substantive in itself. Now, when Immanuel Kant talked about the categorical imperative or about the moral law, what he was saying was that the basis of the moral law is not to be found in anything external or in any circumstance. Rather, the basis for the moral law is going to be dependent or is going to be found on the inherent rationality of human beings. In other words, for Kant, the categorical imperative was a synthetic a priori principle. Now, the reason it was a synthetic a priori principle was A, it is something which applies to all of us, to all human beings, since it talks about or looks at human behavior. It is a priori because it is not dependent or derived from any experience. That is why it is a synthetic a priori principle. By so doing, Kant was actually putting forward a philosophy or a theory of ethics or moral law which was deontological in its approach and not consequentialist, as had been discussed earlier in a previous video about utilitarianism and how it was a consequentialist ethics, which was basically ends justify the means. For Kant, in fact, it was not that ends justify the means, rather he talked about deontological ethics, that there are no predetermined consequences which will determine what moral rule we ought to be following. One such perspective is of situation ethics. Now, what is situation ethics? Like I stated earlier, philosophy or theory was a deontological theory, and situation ethics is again another theory, or looking another way you could say, a perspective of looking at morality or ethics, and it talks about consequences. It is a consequentialist theory of ethics that looks at the results that arise out of an action as being of greater significance than the rules that determine an action. So this view of ethics also focuses on the consequences rather than the inherent worth of a moral action. So it is a consequentialist theory. What does it look at? It looks at the results which arise out of an action. And those results come out of an action, and those results, according to situation ethics, are of a greater significance than the rules which determine what action we ought to do or ought not to do. Situation ethics was basically founded by Joseph Fletcher, a former dean of St. Paul's Cathedral, Cincinnati, and a professor of social ethics at the Episcopal Theology School, Cambridge, Massachusetts, USA. In 1966, he published his Situation Ethics, which he described basically as a fact pamphlet expounding his views on moral action. So Joseph Fletcher, a former dean of St. Paul's Cathedral, Cincinnati, and a professor of social ethics and Episcopal Theology School. As I stated, Fletcher is a consequentialist and based his ethics on the concept of agape or love. Now, according to him, it is human life that is far more significant than moral rules. Further, according to him, it is the constant reviewing and appraisals of moral rules that ought to be the guiding principles. Now, Fletcher's situational ethics has often been confused with utilitarianism. The reason being, both of them are consequentialist theories, and just as Fletcher's situational ethics focuses on agape or love, utilitarianism, whether propounded by Jeremy Bentham or that by John Stuart Mill, talked about the happiness of the number of people. So, greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. John Stuart Mill made a distinction between his theory and that of Jeremy Bentham, wherein he added the principle of qualitative difference between principles of happiness, or the situation that we are going to look at, there ought to be qualitative differences. So he would say it is rather good to have a Socrates satisfied rather than a pig dissatisfied. As I have stated earlier, Fletcher believed that an ethical principle or a system which was based on love or agape best expressed the Christian principle, which was that of love thy neighbor, as it has been expressed in the Bible. For Fletcher, law of love is primary. So any principle that we are talking about, if it is based on this principle of love or agape, is primary, and every other principle is going to be secondary to it. So, as a consequentialist, Fletcher's situational ethics also looks at ends justifying the means. It is also termed as proportionalism, because according to Fletcher, unless and until there is a proportional reason to go against a theory or a principle, one must adhere to it. In other words, there ought to be a proportional rationality, reasoning given why one is not going to accept a theory or a principle, till such time that one is not able to give some such proportional reason. One must go on to adhere to an ethical theory. We come now to Fletcher presenting his theory of situational ethics as a golden mean between two different extremes, that of legalism and antinomianism. Now, what exactly is legalism and antinomianism? Now, according to Fletcher, there are three approaches that are possible in ethics. One is the legalistic approach, the antinomian approach, and the situational approach. Now, the legalistic approach basically has certain predetermined rules. Now, he has given the examples of Judaism and Christianity, wherein both religions have certain set patterns of behavior that have been determined according to the natural law theory. Now, problems arise when these rules conflict with certain rules that one may adapt in a given situation. Say, for example, it is wrong to kill another human being, as has been stated out in Christianity. But what if one were to kill in self-defense? Or what about the killing that one has to resort to in a war? Now, these are situations one may be confronted with in one's life. or if someone is a soldier. Therefore, legalistic approach according to Fletcher is wrong. Why? Because it focuses on the application of predetermined rules. Therefore, Fletcher rejects this approach of ethics as being too narrow. So we cannot operate all the time based on predetermined rules of behavior. Antinomian position is the exact opposite of legalistic position. Now, according to Fletcher, in the antinomian position, each and every situation is considered to be unique. Therefore, making moral choices or decisions becomes a spontaneous act. If all actions are determined by spontaneous choices, that means there are no guiding principles. This position is not workable and therefore it is not acceptable. Situational position is the one that is held by Fletcher and is presented by him as the golden mean between the two extremes, like I mentioned earlier, of legalism and antinomianism. Legalism has predetermined rules and antinomianism is the exact opposite. It is something which is spontaneous. That means the rules are determined then and there. Therefore, Fletcher states, unlike the latter, antinomianism, the situationist ethics enters into every decision-making situation armed with the ethical maxims of his community and its heritage. There is no question of throwing out all laws, rules and commandments. Although Fletcher presents the three approaches, yet he treats ethical maxims with respect and as reflecting the problems he is discussing. But he is ready to cast these ethical principles aside if love seems better served by doing so. So if we look at Fletcher's situationist ethics, if love is to be the guiding principle and any ethical principle is going to serve love better, then the emphasis is on following that ethical principle. That does not mean that Fletcher is throwing out all other ethical maxims. All that he is saying is that we show them the due respect, but if love is the primary serving deciding principle, then all other ethical principles are going to be subordinate to it. The emphasis on love or agape seems to suggest that Fletcher adopted a Christian approach to morality. He in fact criticized Kant's categorical imperative as they could not be implemented in practical situations. Now we come to certain presuppositions that Fletcher had in mind. Now Fletcher put forward certain presuppositions to explain his theory of situation ethics. He termed them as working presuppositions, which comprised of 10 principles in all. 4 were working presuppositions and 6 were termed as fundamental principles. Now, according to Fletcher, it was important to understand the significance of these to grasp his theory of situation ethics. The 4 working presuppositions were A. Pragmatism, that the action that we are doing must be practical. B. Relativism, one must understand that situations vary and are not fixed. In other words, they are relative. 3. Positivism, people can freely choose to believe in agape and act accordingly. And 4. Personalism, laws are meant to benefit the people. The 6 fundamental principles emphasize the concept of agape or love as the basis of moral actions. The principles reiterate the notion of love as being primary determinant with regard to moral actions. The 6 fundamental rules are as follows. Only love is inherently good and nothing else. 2. It is love that acts as the basis for all actions. 3. Love and justice mean the same, because what exactly is the purpose of justice but nothing to distribute love? 4. Love is what we should will for our actions towards our neighbor too, even if we dislike him. Again, a principle of Christianity, love thy neighbor. So even if we hate our neighbor, we should still will for those actions which will benefit or show love towards our neighbor. 5. The end justify the means of the moral actions. That means it is the ends which determine the moral actions that we need to pursue. Then next, it is love that determines the actions and not any prescriptive rule. Therefore, our actions are guided by situations and not predetermined moral rules. Fletcher has cited biblical sources as the basis of his theory of situational ethics, love being the primary guiding principle. Now, if we go on to analyze Fletcher's position, what do we find? When we adopt a critical approach, we cannot but record our dissatisfaction as regards the carelessness with which Fletcher has defined his position. If Aristotle or anyone who held the natural law position were classified as situationists, then that position has been emptied of all meaning by Fletcher's description of situation ethics. The only ones who are exempted from Fletcher's analysis are legalists and antinomians. Now a question arises, would the legalist and antinomians be in a position to set up a whole new concept of morality? As a consequentialist theory of ethics and basing itself on the Christian concept of love has not made Fletcher's situational ethics a viable option? Fletcher's statement that situation ethics goes part of the way with natural law, accepting reasons as the instrument of judgment, while rejecting the notion that good is given in the nature of things objectively, raises doubts whether Fletcher understood natural law and objective morality at all. Fletcher has, to say the least, a rather legalistic definition of love. So long as an act is done selflessly, without the agent seeking any clearly manifest material gain, it is a moral act. Even the sickest of mentally deranged acts could also be roped in as ethically laudable if they were done without any demonstrably material profit being sought in the process. If love is selfless, before one can assess its rightness or wrongness, shouldn't one first inquire into the nature of self? A question can also be asked why love is being set as the norm for morality and not hate. Fletcher probably would answer this question by stating that love enhances one's personhood. It makes one more humane, and hate does not do that. Therefore, love can be a norm for morality. Fletcher claimed that his theory of situation ethics was quite similar to utilitarianism, the only difference being the principle of operation was love or agape. However, as Fletcher tried to define love or agape, it became more complicated and was not as simple as he had thought or proposed it would be. Thus, situational ethics does not seem to be a practical theory at all. Rather, it was individualistic and relative, for a person would act on the basis of a situation. As the decisions are made by the individual based on his or her own situation, the theory seems impractical. It appears to be vague, and the reasons behind the choices given are not clear. So, if we go on to assess situation ethics, despite the criticisms that have been put forward for situation ethics, Fletcher must be given his due for making a serious analysis of love and its authentic meaning. He used the fancy terminology from Tillich to claim that situationalism is a method that proceeds from its one and only one law, that is of agape or love, to Sophia or wisdom, which contains many general rules, to movement of decisions or kairos. It is the moment of decision that the role of wisdom becomes clear. As Fletcher says, legalists make an idol of Sophia, antinomians repudiate it, and situationalists use it. Fletcher uses the famous dictum of Socrates that an unexamined life is not worth living to suggest that unexamined ethical norms are not worth living by. He challenges the concept, ends do not justify means. If ends do not justify means, then what does? For Fletcher, the answer is nothing does. Therefore, he proposes the situation ethics principle, ends justify means. In his theory, it actually all comes down to the basic tenet: everything done from love is morally good or justifiable. But his remark that everything in theory and practice has a price, can be sold for the sake of love, leads to serious consequences. This statement of Fletcher would justify any action, even the most gruesome one. In the end, even if we don't fully endorse Fletcher and his brand of ethics, yet there is something one can learn from him. He has reminded us of the timeless maxim, anything done out of love has an ethical value. Thank you.